Chapter 16 of Persons, Authors, and Things Personated. A person is he whose words or actions are considered either as his own, or as representing the words or actions of another man, or of any other thing to whom they are attributed, whether truly or by fiction. When they are considered as his own, then is he called a natural person, and when they are considered as representing the words and actions of another, then is he a feigned or artificial person. The person is Latin, instead whereof the Greeks have prosopon, which signifies the face, as persona in Latin signifies the disguise or outward appearance of a man, counterfeited on the stage, and sometimes more particularly that part of it which disguiseth the face as a mask or vizard, and from the stage hath been translated to any representer of speech and action, as well in tribunals as theatres. So that a person is the same that an actor is both on the stage and in common conversation, and to personate is to act or represent himself or another. And he that acteth another is said to bear his person, or act in his name, in which sense Cicero useth it where he says, Unus sustineo tres personas mei adversari and judices. I bear 3 persons, my own, my adversaries, and the judges. And is called in divers occasions diversely as a representer or representative, a lieutenant, a vicar, an attorney, a deputy, a procurator, an actor, and the like. Of persons artificial, some have their words and actions owned by those whom they represent, and then the person is the actor, and he that owneth his words and actions is the author. In which case the actor acteth by authority, for that which in speaking of goods and possessions is called an owner, and in Latin dominus, in Greek, kurios, speaking of actions is called author, and as the right of possession is called dominion, so the right of doing any action is called authority. So that by authority is always understood a right of doing any act, and done by authority done by commission or license from him whose right it is. From hence it followeth, that when the actor maketh a covenant by authority, he bindeth thereby the author, no less than if he had made it himself, and no less subjecteth him to all the consequences of the same. And therefore all that hath been said formerly, chapter 14, of the nature of covenants between man and man in their natural capacity, is true also when they are made by their actors, representers, or procurators that have authority from them, so far forth as is in their commission, but no farther. And therefore he that maketh a covenant with the actor, or representer, not knowing the authority he hath, doth it at his own peril. For no man is obliged by a covenant, whereof he is not author, nor consequently by a covenant made against, or beside the authority he gave. When the actor doth anything against the law of nature by command of the author, if he be obliged by former covenant to obey him, not he, but the author breaketh the law of nature. For though the action be against the law of nature, yet it is not his, but contrarily to refuse to do it is against the law of nature that forbiddeth breach of covenant. And he that maketh a covenant with the author, by mediation of the actor, not knowing what authority he hath, but only takes his word, in case such authority be not made manifest unto him upon demand, is no longer obliged. For the covenant made with the author is not valid without his counter-assurance. But if he that so covenanteth knew beforehand he was to expect no other assurance than the actor's word, then is the covenant valid, because the actor in this case maketh himself the author. And therefore, as when the authority is evident, the covenant obligeth the author, not the actor. So when the authority is feigned, it obligeth the actor only, there being no author but himself. There are few things that are incapable of being represented by fiction. Inanimate things, as a church, an hospital, a bridge, may be personated by a rector, master, or overseer, but things inanimate cannot be authors, nor therefore give authority to their actors. Yet the actors may have authority to procure their maintenance, given them by those that are owners or governors of those things, and therefore such things cannot be personated before there be some state of civil government. Likewise children, fools, and madmen that have no use of reason may be personated by guardians or curators, but can be no authors, during that time, of any action done by them, longer than, when they shall recover the use of reason, they shall judge the same reasonable. Yet during the folly, he that hath right of governing them may give authority to the guardian. But this again has no place but in a state civil, because before such a state there is no dominion of persons. An idol, or mere figment of the brain, may be personated, as were the gods of the heathen, which by such officers as the state appointed were personated and held possessions and other goods and rights, which men from time to time dedicated and consecrated unto them. But idols cannot be authors, for an idol is nothing. The authority proceeded from the state, and therefore, before introduction of civil government, the gods of the heathen could not be personated. The true God may be personated, as he was, first by Moses, who governed the Israelites, that were not his, but God's people, not in his own name, with hoc dicit Moses, but in God's name, with hoc dicit Dominus. Secondly, by the Son of Man, his own Son, our blessed Saviour Jesus Christ, that came to reduce the Jews and induce all nations into the kingdom of his Father, not as of himself, but as sent from his Father. And thirdly, by the Holy Ghost, or Comforter, speaking and working in the apostles, which Holy Ghost was a Comforter that came not of himself, but was sent, and proceedeth from them both. A multitude of men are made one person, when they are by one man or one person represented, so that it be done with the consent of every one of that multitude in particular. For it is the unity of the representer, not the unity of the represented, that maketh the person one. And it is the representer that beareth the person, and but one person, and unity cannot otherwise be understood in multitude. And because the multitude naturally is not one but many, they cannot be understood for one, but many authors, of everything their representative faith, or doth in their name, every man giving their common representer authority from himself in particular, and owing all the actions the representer doeth, in case they give him authority without stint. Otherwise, when they limit him in what and how far he shall represent them, none of them owneth more than they gave him commission to act. And if the representative consist of many men, the voice of the greater number must be considered as the voice of them all. For if the lesser number pronounce, for example, in the affirmative, and the greater in the negative, there will be negatives more than enough to destroy the affirmatives, and thereby the excess of negatives standing uncontradicted are the only voice the representative hath. And a representative of even number, especially when the number is not great, whereby the contradictory voices are oftentimes equal, is therefore oftentimes mute and incapable of action. Yet in some cases contradictory voices equal in number may determine a question, as in condemning or absolving equality of votes, even in that they condemn not, do absolve. But not on the contrary condemn, in that they absolve not. For when a cause is heard, not to condemn, is to absolve. But on the contrary to say that not absolving is condemning is not true. The like it is in a deliberation of executing presently, or deferring till another time. For when the voices are equal, the not decreeing execution is a decree of dilation. Or if the number be odd, as 3 or more, men or assemblies, whereof every one has by a negative voice authority to take away the effect of all the affirmative voices of the rest, this number is no representative, because by the diversity of opinions and interests of men, it becomes oftentimes, and in cases of the greatest consequence, a mute person and unapt, as for many things else, so for the government of a multitude, especially in time of war. Of authors there be two sorts. The first simply so called, which I have before defined to be him that owneth the action of another simply. The second is he that owneth an action or covenant of another conditionally, that is to say, he undertaketh to do it, if the other doth it not at or before a certain time. And these authors conditional are generally called sureties, in Latin fidejussores and sponsores, and particularly for debt praedis, and for appearance before a judge or magistrate vedis. Part 2 of Commonwealth. Chapter 17 of the causes, generation, and definition of a commonwealth. The final cause, end, or design of men, who naturally love liberty and dominion over others, is the introduction of that restraint upon themselves, in which we see them live in commonwealth, is the foresight of their own preservation and of a more contented life thereby, that is to say, of getting themselves out from that miserable condition of war which is necessarily consequent, as hath been shown, to the natural passions of men, when there is no visible power to keep them in awe and tie them by fear of punishment to the performance of their covenants, and observation of these laws of nature set down in the 14th and 15th chapters. For the laws of nature, as justice, equity, modesty, mercy, and in sum doing to others as we would be done to, if themselves, without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed, are contrary to our natural passions that carry us to partiality, pride, revenge, and the like. And covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all. Therefore, notwithstanding the laws of nature, which every one hath then kept, when he has a will to keep them when he can do it safely, if there be no power erected, or not great enough for our security, every man will and may lawfully rely on his own strength and art, for caution against all other men. And in all places where men lived by small families, to rob and spoil one another has been a trade, and so far from being reputed against the law of nature, that the greater spoils they gained, the greater was their honour, and men observed no other laws therein but the laws of honour. That is, to abstain from cruelty, leaving to men their lives and instruments of husbandry, and as small families did then, so now do cities and kingdoms, which are but greater families, for their own security, enlarge their dominions upon all pretences of danger and fear of invasion, or assistance that may be given to invaders, endeavour as much as they can to subdue or weaken their neighbours by open force and secret arts, for want of other caution, justly, and are remembered for it in after ages with honour. Nor is it the joining together of a small number of men that gives them this security, because in small numbers, small additions on the one side or the other make the advantage of strength so great as is sufficient to carry the victory, and therefore gives encouragement to an invasion. The multitude sufficient to confide in for our security is not determined by any certain number, but by comparison with the enemy we fear, and is then sufficient, when the odds of the enemy is not of so visible and conspicuous moment, to determine the event of war, as to move him to attempt. And be there never so great a multitude, yet if their actions be directed according to their particular judgments and particular appetites, they can expect thereby no defence, nor protection, neither against a common enemy, nor against the injuries of one another. For being distracted in opinions concerning the best mutual opposition to nothing, whereby they are easily, not only subdued by a very few that agree together, but also when there is no common enemy, they make war upon each other for their particular interests. For if we could suppose a great multitude of men to consent in the observation of justice and other laws of nature without a common power to keep them all in awe, we might as well suppose all mankind to do the same, and then there neither would be nor need to be any civil government or commonwealth at all, because there would be peace without subjection. Nor is it enough for the security which men desire should last all the time of their life, that they be governed and directed by one judgment for a limited time, as in one battle or one war. For though they obtain a victory by their unanimous endeavour against a foreign enemy, yet afterwards, when either they have no common enemy, or he that by one part is held for an enemy is by another part held for a friend, they must needs by the difference of their interests dissolve and fall again into a war amongst themselves. It is true that certain living creatures, as bees and ants, live sociably one with another, which are therefore by Aristotle numbered amongst political creatures, and yet have no other direction than their particular judgments and appetites, nor speech whereby one of them can signify to another what he thinks expedient for the common benefit, and therefore some man may perhaps desire to know why mankind cannot do the same, to which I answer, first, that men are continually in competition for honour and dignity, which these creatures are not, and consequently amongst men there ariseth on that ground envy and hatred and finally war, but amongst these not so. Secondly, that amongst these creatures the common good differeth not from the private, and being by nature inclined to their private, they procure thereby the common benefit. But man, whose joy consisteth in comparing himself with other men, can relish nothing but what is eminent. Thirdly, that these creatures, having not as man the use of reason, do not see, nor think they see any fault in the administration of their common business, whereas amongst men there are very many that think themselves wiser and abler to govern the public better than the rest, and these strive to reform and innovate, one this way, another that way, and thereby bring it into distraction and civil war. Fourthly, that these creatures, though they have some use of voice, in making known to one another their desires and other affections, yet they want that art of words, by which some men can represent to others that which is good in the likeness of evil, and evil in the likeness of good, and augment or diminish the apparent greatness of good and evil, discontenting men, and troubling their peace at their pleasure. Fifthly, irrational creatures cannot distinguish between injury and damage, and therefore, as long as they be at ease, they are not offended with their fellows, whereas man is then most troublesome when he is most at ease. For then it is that he loves to show his wisdom and control the actions of them that govern the commonwealth. Lastly, the agreement of these creatures is natural, that of men is by covenant only, which is artificial, and therefore it is no wonder if there be somewhat else required besides covenant to make their agreement constant and lasting, which is a common power to keep them in awe and to direct their actions to the common benefit. The only way to erect such a common power as may be able to defend them from the invasion of foreigners and the injury of one another, and thereby to secure them in such sort, as that by their own industry and by the fruits of the earth they may nourish themselves and live contentedly, is to confer all their power and strength upon one man, or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will. Which is as much as to say, to appoint one man, or assembly of men, to bear their person, and every one to own, and acknowledge himself to be author of whatsoever he that so beareth their person shall act, or cause to be acted, in those things which concern the common peace and safety, and therein to submit their wills, every one to his will, and their judgments to his judgment. This is more than consent or concord. It is a real unity of them all, in one and the same person, made by covenant of every man, with every man, in such manner as if every man should say to every man, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man, or to this assembly of men, on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him, and authorize all his actions in like manner. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth, in Latin civitas. This is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God, to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. For by this authority, given him by every particular man in the commonwealth, he hath the use of so much power and strength conferred on him that by terror thereof he is enabled to form the wills of them all, to peace at home, and mutual aid against their enemies abroad. And in him consisteth the essence of the commonwealth, which, to define it, is one person of whose acts a great multitude by mutual covenants one with another have made themselves every one the author, to the end he may use the strength and means of them all, as he shall think expedient for their peace and common defence. And he that carrieth this person is called sovereign, and said to have sovereign power, and every one besides his subject. And the attaining of this sovereign power is by two ways, one by natural force, as when a man maketh his children to submit themselves and their children to his government, as being able to destroy them if they refuse, or by war subdueth his enemies to his will, giving them their lives on that condition. The other is when men agree amongst themselves to submit to some man or assembly of men voluntarily, on confidence to be protected by him against all others. This later may be called a political commonwealth, or commonwealth by institution, and the former a commonwealth by acquisition. And first, I shall speak of a commonwealth by institution. Chapter 18. Of the rights of sovereigns by institution. A commonwealth is said to be instituted when a multitude of men do agree and covenant every one with every one, that to whatsoever man or assembly of men shall be given by the major part the right to present the person of them all, that is to say, to be their representative, every one, as well he that voted for it as he that voted against it, shall authorize all the actions and judgments of that man or assembly of men in the same manner as if they were his own, to the end to live peaceably amongst themselves and be protected against other men. The consequences to such institutions are, 1. The subjects cannot change the form of government. From this institution of a commonwealth are derived all rights and faculties of him, or them, on whom the sovereign power is conferred by the consent of the people assembled. First, because they covenant it is to be understood they are not obliged by former covenant to anything repugnant hereunto, and consequently, they that have already instituted a commonwealth, being thereby bound by covenant to own the actions and judgments of one, cannot lawfully make a new covenant amongst themselves to be obedient to any other, in any thing whatsoever, without his permission. And therefore, they that are subjects to a monarch cannot without his leave cast off monarchy, and return to the confusion of a disunited multitude, nor transfer their person from him that beareth it to another man, or other assembly of men. For they are bound every man, to own and be reputed author of all, that he that already is their sovereign shall do and judge fit to be done, so that any one man dissenting, all the rest should break their covenant made to that man, which is injustice, and they have also every man given the sovereignty to him that beareth their person, and therefore, if they depose him, they take from him that which is his own, and so again it is injustice. Besides, if he that attempteth to depose his sovereign be killed or punished by him for such attempt, he is author of his own punishment, as being by the institution author of all his sovereign shall do. And because it is injustice for a man to do anything for which he may be punished by his own authority, he is also upon that title unjust. And whereas some men have pretended for their disobedience to their sovereign a new covenant made, not with men but with God, this also is injustice, For there is no covenant with God but by mediation of some body that representeth God's person, which none doth but God's lieutenant, who hath the sovereignty under God. But this pretense of covenant with God is so evident a lie, even in the pretenders' own consciences, that it is not only an act of an unjust, but also of a vile and unmanly disposition. Secondly, because the right of bearing the person of them all is given to him they make sovereign, by covenant only of one to another, and not of him to any of them, there can happen no breach of covenant on the part of the sovereign, and consequently none of his subjects, by any pretense of forfeiture, can be freed from his subjection. That he which is made sovereign maketh no covenant with his subjects beforehand is manifest, because either he must make it with the whole multitude, as one party to the covenant, or he must make a several covenant with every man. With the whole, as one party, it is impossible, because as yet they are not one person. And if he makes so many several covenants as there be men, those covenants after he hath the sovereignty are void, because what act soever can be pretended by any one of them for breach thereof, is the act both of himself and of all the rest, because done in the person and by the right of every one of them in particular. Besides, if any one or more of them pretend a breach of the covenant made by the sovereign at his institution, and others or one other of his subjects or himself alone pretend there was no such breach, there is in this case no judge to decide the controversy. It returns therefore to the sword again, and every man recovereth the right of protecting himself by his own strength, contrary to the design they had in the institution. It is therefore in vain to grant sovereignty by way of precedent covenant. The opinion that any monarch receiveth his power by covenant, that is to say on condition, proceedeth from want of understanding this easy truth, that covenants being but words and breath, have no force to oblige, contain, constrain, or protect any man, but what it has from the public sword. That is, from the untied hands of that man or assembly of men that hath the sovereignty, and whose actions are avouched by them all, and performed by the strength of them all, in him united. But when an assembly of men is made sovereign, then no man imagineth any such covenant to have passed in the institution. For no man is so dull as to say, for example, the people of Rome made a covenant with the Romans to hold the sovereignty on such or such conditions, which, not performed, the Romans might lawfully depose the Roman people. That men see not the reason to be alike in a monarchy and in a popular government proceedeth from the ambition of some that are kinder to the government of an assembly whereof they may hope to participate, than of monarchy, which they despair to enjoy. Thirdly, because the major part hath by consenting voices declared a sovereign, he that dissented must now consent with the rest, that is, be contented to avow all the actions he shall do, or else justly be destroyed by the rest. For if he voluntarily enter into the congregation of them that were assembled, he sufficiently declared thereby his will, and therefore tacitly covenanted, to stand to what the major part should ordain, and therefore if he refuse to stand thereto, or make protestation against any of their decrees, he does contrary to his covenant, and therefore unjustly. And whether he be of the congregation or not, and whether his consent be asked or not, he must either submit to their decrees, or be left in the condition of war he was in before, wherein he might without injustice be destroyed by any man whatsoever. Fourthly, because every subject is by this institution author of all the actions and judgments of the sovereign instituted, it follows that whatsoever he doth, it can be no injury to any of his subjects, nor ought to be by any of them accused of injustice. For he that doth anything by authority from another, doth therein no injury to him by whose authority he acteth. But by this institution of a commonwealth every particular man is author of all the sovereign doth. And consequently he that complaineth of injury from his sovereign complaineth of what whereof he himself is author, and therefore ought not to accuse any man but himself, no nor himself of injury, because to do injury to oneself is impossible. It is true that they that have sovereign power may commit iniquity, but not injustice or injury in the proper signification. Fifthly, and consequently to that which was said last, no man that hath sovereign power can justly be put to death, or otherwise in any manner by his subjects punished. For seeing every subject is author of the actions of his sovereign, he punisheth another for the actions committed by himself. And because the end of this institution is the peace and defence of them all, and whosoever has right to the end, has right to the means, it belongeth of right to whatsoever man or assembly that hath sovereignty to be judge both of the means of peace and defence, and also of the hindrances and disturbances of the same, and to do whatsoever he shall think necessary to be done, both beforehand for the preserving of peace and security, by prevention of discord at home and hostility from abroad, and when peace and security are lost, for the recovery of the same. And therefore, sixthly, it is annexed to the sovereignty to be judge of what opinions and doctrines are averse, and what conducing to peace, and consequently on what occasions, how far, and what men are to be trusted withal in speaking to multitudes of people, and who shall examine the doctrines of all books before they be published. For the actions of men proceed from their opinions, and in the well-governing of opinions consisteth the well-governing of men's actions, in order to their peace and concord. And though in matter of doctrine nothing ought to be regarded but the truth, yet this is not repugnant to regulating of the same by peace. For doctrine repugnant to peace can no more be truth than peace and concord can be against the law of nature. It is true that in a commonwealth whereby the negligence or unskilfulness of governors and teachers, false doctrines are by time generally received. The contrary truths may be generally offensive, yet the most sudden and rough bustling in of a new truth that can be, does never break the peace, but only sometimes awake the war. For those men that are so remissly governed that they dare take up arms to defend or introduce an opinion are still in war, and their condition not peace, but only a cessation of arms for fear of one another, and they live, as it were, in the precincts of battle continually. It belongeth therefore to him that hath the sovereign power to be judge or constitute all judges of opinions and doctrines as a thing necessary to peace, thereby to prevent discord and civil war. Seventhly, is annexed to the sovereignty the whole power of prescribing the rules whereby every man may know what goods he may enjoy and what actions he may do without being molested by any of his fellow subjects, and this is it men call propriety. For before constitution of sovereign power, as hath already been shown, all men had right to all things, which necessarily causeth war, and therefore this propriety, being necessary to peace, and depending on sovereign power, is the act of the power in order to the public peace. These rules of propriety, or meum and tuum, and of good, evil, lawful, and unlawful in the actions of subjects are the civil laws, that is to say, the laws of each commonwealth in particular, though the name of civil law be now restrained to the ancient civil laws of the city of Rome, which being the head of a great part of the world, her laws at that time were in these parts the civil law. Eighthly, is annexed to the sovereignty the right of judicature, that is to say, of hearing and deciding all controversies which may arise concerning law either civil or natural, or concerning fact. For without the decision of controversies, there is no protection of one subject against the injuries of another. The laws concerning meum and tuum are in vain, and to every man remaineth, from the natural and necessary appetite of his own conservation, the right of protecting himself by his private strength, which is the condition of war, and contrary to the end for which every commonwealth is instituted. Ninthly, is annexed to the sovereignty the right of making war and peace with other nations and commonwealths, that is to say, of judging when it is for the public good, and how great forces are to be assembled, armed, and paid for that end, and to levy money upon the subjects to defray the expenses thereof. For the power by which the people are to be defended consisteth in their armies, and the strength of an army in the union of their strength under one command, which command the sovereign instituted therefore hath. Because the command of the militia without other institution maketh him that hath it sovereign, and therefore whosoever is made general of an army, he that hath the sovereign power is always generalissimo. Tenthly, is annexed to the sovereignty the choosing of all councillors, ministers, magistrates, and officers both in peace and war. For seeing the sovereign is charged with the end, which is the common peace and defence, he is understood to have power to use such means as he shall think most fit for his discharge. 11thly, to the sovereign is committed the power of rewarding with riches or honour, and of punishing with corporal or pecuniary punishment, or with ignominy every subject according to the law he hath formerly made. Or if there be no law made, according as he shall judge most to conduce to the encouraging of men to serve the commonwealth, or deterring of them from doing disservice to the same. Lastly, considering what values men are naturally apt to set upon themselves, what respect they look for from others, and how little they value other men, from whence continually arise amongst them emulation, quarrels, factions, and at last war, to the destroying of one another and diminution of their strength against a common enemy, it is necessary that there be laws of honour, and a public rate of the worth of such men as have deserved, or are able to deserve well of the commonwealth, and that there be force in the hands of some or other to put these laws in execution. But it hath already been shown that not only the whole militia or forces of the commonwealth, but also the judicature of all controversies is annexed to the sovereignty. To the sovereign, therefore, it belongeth also to give titles of honour, and to appoint what order of place and dignity each man shall hold, and what signs of respect in public or private meetings they shall give to one another. These are the rights which make the essence of sovereignty, and which are the marks whereby a man may discern in what man or assembly of men the sovereign power is placed and resideth. For these are incommunicable and inseparable. The power to coin money, to dispose of the estate, and persons of infant heirs, to have preemption in markets and all other statute prerogatives, may be transferred by the sovereign, and yet the power to protect his subject be retained. But if he transfer the militia, he retains the judicature in vain, for want of execution of the laws. Or if he grant away the power of raising money, the militia is in vain. Or if he give away the government of doctrines, men will be frighted into rebellion with the fear of spirits. And so if we consider any one of the said rights, we shall presently see that the holding of all the rest will produce no effect in the conservation of peace and justice, the end for which all commonwealths are instituted. And this division is it, whereof it is said, a kingdom divided in itself cannot stand. For unless this division precede, division into opposite armies can never happen. If there had not first been an opinion received of the greatest part of England, that these powers were divided between the king and the lords and the House of Commons, the people had never been divided and fallen into this civil war, first between those that disagreed in politics, and after between the dissenters about the liberty of religion, which have so instructed men in this point of sovereign right, that there be few now in England that do not see that these rights are inseparable, and will be so generally acknowledged at the next return of peace, and so continue till their miseries are forgotten, and no longer except the vulgar be better taught than they have hitherto been. And because they are essential and inseparable rights, it follows necessarily that in whatsoever words any of them seem to be granted away, yet if the sovereign power itself be not in direct terms renounced, and the name of sovereign no more given by the grantees to him that grants them, the grant is void. For when he has granted all he can, if we grant back the sovereignty, all is restored as inseparably annexed thereunto. This great authority being indivisible and inseparably annexed to the sovereignty, there is little ground for the opinion of them that say of sovereign kings, though they be singulis majoris, of greater power than every one of their subjects, yet they by universal minoris, of less power than them altogether. For if by altogether they mean not the collective body as one person, then altogether and every one signify the same, and the speech is absurd. But if by altogether they understand them as one person, which person the sovereign bears, then the power of altogether is the same with the sovereign's power, and so again the speech is absurd, which absurdity they see well enough when the sovereignty is in an assembly of the people, but in a monarch they see it not, and yet the power of sovereignty is the same in whomsoever it be placed. And as the power, so also the honour of the sovereign ought to be greater than that of any, or all the subjects. For in the sovereignty is the fountain of honour. The dignities of lord, earl, duke, and prince are his creatures, as in the presence of the master, and servants are equal, and without any honour at all. So are the subjects, in the presence of the sovereign. And though they shine some more, some less, when they are out of his sight, yet in his presence they shine no more than the stars in the presence of the sun. But a man may here object that the condition of subjects is very miserable, as being obnoxious to the lusts and other irregular passions of him, or them that have so unlimited a power in their hands. And commonly they that live under a monarch think it the fault of monarchy, and they that live under the government of democracy, or other sovereign assembly, attribute all the inconvenience to that form of commonwealth, whereas the power in all forms, if they be perfect enough to protect them, is the same, not considering that the estate of man can never be without some incommodity or other. And that the greatest that in any form of government can possibly happen to the people in general is scarce sensible in respect of the miseries and horrible calamities that accompany a civil war, or that dissolute condition of masterless men, without subjection to laws and a coercive power to tie their hands from rapine and revenge. Nor considering that the greatest pressure of sovereign governors proceedeth not from any delight or profit they can expect in the damage or weakening of their subjects, in whose vigour consisteth their own selves, that unwilling contribution to their own defence make it necessary for their governors to draw from them what they can in time of peace, that they may have means on any emergent occasion or sudden need to resist or take advantage on their enemies. For all men are by nature provided of notable multiplying glasses, that is, their passions and self-love, through which every little payment appeareth a great grievance, but are destitute of those prospective glasses, namely moral and civil science, to see afar off the miseries that hang over them, and cannot without such payments be avoided. Chapter 19. Of the several kinds of commonwealths by institution, and of succession to the sovereign power. The different forms of commonwealths. The difference of commonwealths consisteth in the difference of the sovereign or the person representative of all and every one of the multitude. And because the sovereignty is either in one man or in an assembly of more than one, and into that assembly either every man hath right to enter, or not every one, but certain men distinguished from the rest, it is manifest there can be three kinds of commonwealth. For the representative must needs be one man, or more, and if more, then it is an assembly of all, or but of a part. When the representative is one man, then is the commonwealth a monarchy. When an assembly of all that will come together, then it is a democracy, or popular commonwealth. When an assembly of part only, then it is called an aristocracy. Other kind of commonwealth there can be none, for either one or more or all must have the sovereign power, which I have shown to be indivisible entire. There be other names of government in the histories and books of policy, as tyranny and oligarchy, but they are not the names of other forms of government, but of the same forms misliked. For they that are discontented under monarchy call it tyranny, and they that are displeased with aristocracy call it oligarchy. So also, they which find themselves grieved under a democracy call it anarchy, which signifies want of government. And yet I think no man believes that want of government is any new kind of government. Nor by the same reason ought they to believe that the government is of one kind when they like it, and another when they mislike it, or are oppressed by the governors. It is manifest that men who are in absolute liberty may, if they please, give authority to one man to represent them every one, as well as give such authority to any assembly of men whatsoever, and consequently may subject themselves, if they think good, to a monarch, as absolutely as to any other representative. Therefore, when there is already erected a sovereign power, there can be no other representative of the same people, but only to certain particular ends, by the sovereign limited. For that were to erect two sovereigns, and every man to have his person represented by two actors, that by opposing one another must needs divide that power, which, if men will live in peace, is indivisible, and thereby reduce the multitude into the condition of war, contrary to the end for which all sovereignty is instituted. And therefore as it is absurd to think that a sovereign assembly, inviting the people of their dominion to send up their deputies, with power to make known their advice or desires, should therefore hold such deputies rather than themselves for the absolute representative of the people. So it is absurd also to think the same in a monarchy, and I know not how this so manifest a truth should of late be so little observed, that in a monarchy he that had the sovereignty from a descent of 600 years was alone called sovereign, had the title of majesty from every one of his subjects, and was unquestionably taken by them for their king, was notwithstanding never considered as their representative. That name without contradiction passing for the title of those men, which at his command were sent up by the people to carry their petitions, and give him, if he permitted it, their advice. Which may serve as an admonition for those that are the true and absolute representative of a people, to instruct men in the nature of that office, and to take heed how they admit of any other general representation upon any occasion whatsoever, if they mean to discharge the truth committed to them. The difference between these kinds of commonwealth consisteth not in the difference of power, but in the difference of convenience or aptitude to produce the peace and security of the people, for which end they were instituted. And to compare a monarchy with the other two, we may observe, first, that whosoever beareth the person of the people, or is one of that assembly that bears it, beareth also his own natural person. And though he be careful in his politic person to procure the common interest, yet he is more, or no less, careful to procure the private good of himself, his family, kindred, and friends, and for the most part, if the public interest chance to cross the private, he prefers the private. For the passions of men are commonly more potent than their reason, from whence it follows that where the public and private interest are most closely united, there is the public most advanced. Now, in monarchy, the private interest is the same with the public. The riches, power, and honor of a monarch arise only from the riches, strength, and reputation of his subjects. For no king can be rich, nor glorious, nor secure, whose subjects are either poor or contemptible, or too weak through want or dissension to maintain a war against their enemies. Whereas in a democracy or aristocracy, the public prosperity confers not so much to the private fortune of one that is corrupt or ambitious, as doth many times a perfidious advice, a treacherous action, or a civil war. Secondly, that a monarch receiveth counsel of whom, when, and where he pleaseth, and consequently may hear the opinion of men versed in the matter about which he deliberates, of what rank or quality soever, and as long before the time of action, and with as much secrecy as he will. But when a sovereign assembly has need of counsel, none are admitted but such as have a right thereto from the beginning, which for the most part are of those who have been versed more in the acquisition of wealth than of knowledge, and are to give their advice in long discourses, which may and do commonly excite men to action, but not govern them in it. For the understanding is by the flame of the passions, never enlightened, but dazzled. Nor is there any place or time wherein an assembly can receive counsel with secrecy, because of their own multitude. Thirdly, that the resolutions of a monarch are subject to no other inconsistency than that of humane nature. But in assemblies besides that of nature there ariseth an inconstancy from the number. For the absence of a few that would have the resolution once taken continue firm, which may happen by security, negligence, or private impediments, or the diligent appearance of a few of the contrary opinion, undoes today all that was concluded yesterday. Fourthly, that a monarch cannot disagree with himself out of envy or interest, but an assembly may, and that to such a height as may produce a civil war. Fifthly, that in monarch there is this inconvenience that any subject, by the power of one man, for the enriching of a favourite or flatterer, may be deprived of all he possesseth, which I confess is a great and inevitable inconvenience. But the same may as well happen where the sovereign power is in an assembly, for their power is the same, and they are as subject to evil counsel, and to be seduced by orators, as a monarch by flatterers, and becoming one another's flatterers, serve one another's covetousness and ambition by turns. And whereas the favourites of an assembly are many, and the kindred much more numerous than of any monarch. Besides, there is no favourite of a monarch which cannot as well succour his friends as hurt his enemies. But orators, that is to say, favourites of the sovereign assemblies, though they have great power to hurt, have little to save. For to accuse requires less eloquence, such as man's nature, than to excuse, and condemnation than absolution more resembles justice. Sixthly, that it is an inconvenience in monarchy that the sovereignty may descend upon an infant, or one that cannot discern between good and evil, and consisteth in this, that the use of his power must be in the hand of another man, or of some assembly of men, which are to govern by his right, and in his name as curators and protectors of his person and authority. But to say there is inconvenience in putting the use of the sovereign power into the hand of a man, or an assembly of men, is to say that all government is more inconvenient than confusion and civil war, and therefore all the danger that can be pretended must arise from the contention of those that for an office of so great honour and profit may become competitors. To make it appear that this inconvenience proceedeth not from that form of government we call monarchy, we are to consider that the precedent monarch hath appointed who shall have the tuition of his infant successor, either expressly by testament, or tacitly by not controlling the custom in that case received. And then such inconvenience, if it happen, is to be attributed not to the monarchy, but to the ambition and injustice of the subjects, which in all kinds of government, where the people are not well instructed in their duty and the rights of sovereignty, is the same. Or else the precedent monarch hath not at all taken order for such tuition, and then the law of nature hath provided this sufficient rule, that the tuition shall be in him that hath by nature most interest in the preservation of the authority of the infant, and to whom least benefit can accrue by his death or diminution. For seeing every man by nature seeketh his own benefit and promotion, to put an infant into the power of those that can promote themselves by his destruction or damage is not tuition, but treachery. So that sufficient provision being taken against all just quarrel about the government under a child, if any contention arise to the disturbance of the public peace, it is not to be attributed to the form of monarchy, but to the ambition of subjects and ignorance of their duty. On the other side, there is no great commonwealth, the sovereignty whereof is in a great assembly, which is not, as to consultations of peace and war and making of laws, in the same condition as if the government were in a child. For as a child wants the government to dissent from counsel given him, and is thereby necessitated to take the advice of them or him to whom he is committed, so an assembly wanteth the liberty to dissent from the counsel of the major part, be it good or bad. And as a child has need of a tutor or protector to preserve his person and authority, So also in great commonwealths, the sovereign assembly, in all great dangers and troubles, have need to custodes libertatis, that is, of dictators or protectors of their authority, which are as much as temporary monarchs, to whom for a time they may commit the entire exercise of their power, and have, at the end of that time, been oftener deprived thereof than infant kings by their protectors, regents, or any other tutors. Though the kinds of sovereignty be, as I have now shown, but three, that is to say, monarchy, where one man has it, or democracy, where a general assembly of subjects hath it, or aristocracy, where it is an assembly of certain persons nominated, or otherwise distinguished from the rest, yet he that shall consider the particular commonwealths that have been, and are in the world, will not perhaps easily reduce them to three, and may thereby be inclined to think there be other forms, arising from these mingled together, as for example elective kingdoms, where kings have the sovereign power put into their hands for a time, of kingdoms wherein the king hath power limited, which governments are nevertheless by most writers called monarchy. Likewise, if a popular or aristocratical commonwealth subdue an enemy's country, and govern the same by a president, procurator, or other magistrate, this may seem, perhaps at first, to be a democratical or aristocratical government, but it is not so. For elective kings are not sovereigns, but ministers of the sovereign, nor limited kings sovereigns, but ministers of them that have the sovereign power. Nor are those provinces which are in subjection to a democracy or aristocracy of another commonwealth democratically or aristocratically governed, but monarchically. First, concerning an elective king, whose power is limited to his life, as it is in many places of Christendom at this day, or to certain years or months, as the dictator's power amongst the Romans, if he have right to appoint his successor, he is no more elective but hereditary. But if he have no power to elect his successor, then there is some other man or assembly known, which, after his decease, may elect anew, or else the commonwealth dieth, and dissolveth with him, and returneth to the condition of war. If it be known who have the power to give the sovereignty after his death, it is known also that the sovereignty was in them before. For none have right to give that which they have not right to possess, and keep to themselves, if they think good. But if there be none that can give the sovereignty after the decease of him that was first elected, then has he power, nay, he is obliged by the law of nature to provide, by establishing his successor, to keep those that had trusted him with the government from relapsing into the miserable condition of civil war, and consequently he was, when elected, a sovereign absolute. Secondly, that king whose power is limited is not superior to him or them that have the power to limit it. And he that is not superior is not supreme, that is to say, not sovereign. The sovereignty, therefore, was always in that assembly, which had the right to limit him, and by consequence the government, not monarchy, but either democracy or aristocracy, as of old time in Sparta, where the kings had a privilege to lead their armies, but the sovereignty was in the ephori. Thirdly, whereas heretofore the Roman people governed the land of Judea, for example, by a president, yet was not Judea therefore a democracy, because they were not governed by any assembly into which any of them had right to enter, nor by an aristocracy, because they were not governed by any assembly into which any man could enter by their election, but they were governed by one person, which, though as to the people of Rome was an assembly of the people, or democracy, yet as to the people of Judea, which had no right at all of participating in the government, was a monarch. For though where the people are governed by an assembly, chosen by themselves, out of their own number, the government is called a democracy or aristocracy, yet when they are governed by an assembly, not of their own choosing, 'tis a monarchy, not of one man over another man, but of one people over another people. Of all these forms of government, the matter being mortal, so that not only monarchs, but also whole assemblies die, it is necessary for the conservation of the peace of men, that as there was order taken for an artificial man, so there be order also taken for an artificial eternity of life, without which men that are governed by an assembly should return into the condition of war in every age, and they that are governed by one man, as soon as their governor dieth. This artificial eternity is that which men call the right of succession. There is no perfect form of government, where the disposing of the succession is not in the present sovereign. For if it be in any other particular man or private assembly, it is in a person subject, and may be assumed by the sovereign at his pleasure, and consequently the right is in himself. And if it be in no particular man, but left to a new choice, then is the commonwealth dissolved, and the right is in him that can get it, contrary to the intention of them that did institute the commonwealth for their perpetual and not temporary security. In a democracy, the whole assembly cannot fail, unless the multitude that are to be governed fail. and therefore questions of the right of succession have in that form of government no place at all. In an aristocracy, when any of the assembly dieth, the election of another into his room belongeth to the assembly, as the sovereign, to whom belongeth the choosing of all councillors and officers. For that which the representative doth, as actor, every one of the subjects doth, as author. And though the sovereign assembly may give power to others, to elect new men for supply of their court, yet it is still by their authority that the election is made, and by the same it may, when the public shall require it, be recalled. The present monarch hath right to dispose of the succession. The greatest difficulty about the right of succession is in monarchy, and the difficulty ariseth from this, that at first sight it is not manifest who is to appoint the successor, nor many times who it is whom he hath appointed. For in both these cases there is required a more exact ratiocination than every man is accustomed to use. As to the question, who shall appoint the successor of a monarch that hath the sovereign authority, that is to say, for elective kings and princes have not the sovereign power in propriety, but in use only, we are to consider that either he that is in possession has the right to dispose of the succession, or else that right is again in the dissolved multitude. For the death of him that hath the sovereign power and propriety leaves the multitude without any sovereignty at all, that is, without any representative in whom they should be united, and be capable of doing any one action at all, and therefore they are incapable of election of any new monarch, every man having equal right to submit himself to such as he thinks best able to protect him, or if he can, protect himself by his own sword, which is a return to confusion and to the condition of a war of every man against every man, contrary to the end for which monarchy had its first institution. Therefore it is manifest that by the institution of monarchy, the disposing of the successor is always left to the judgment and will of the present possessor. And for the question which may arise sometimes, who it is that the monarch in possession hath designed to the succession and inheritance of his power, it is determined by his express words and testament, or by other tacit signs sufficient. By express words or testament, when it is declared by him in his lifetime, viva voce, or as by writing, as the first emperors of Rome declared who should be their heirs. For the word heir does not of itself imply the children or nearest kindred of a man, but whomsoever a man shall any way declare he would have to succeed him in his estate. If therefore a monarch declare expressly that such a man shall be his heir either by word or writing, then it is that man immediately after the decease of his predecessor invested in the right of being monarch. But where testament and express word are wanting, other natural signs of the will are to be followed, whereof the one is custom, and therefore where the custom is, that the next of kindred absolutely succeedeth, there also the next of kindred hath right to the succession, for that, if the will of him that was in possession had been otherwise, he might easily have declared the same in his lifetime. And likewise where the custom is, that the next of the male kindred succeedeth, there also the right of succession is in the next of the kindred male, for the same reason. And so it is if the custom were to advance the female. For whatsoever custom a man may by a word control, and does not, it is a natural sign he would have that custom stand. But where neither custom nor testament hath preceded, there it is to be understood first, that a monarch's will is that the government remain monarchical, because he hath approved that government in himself. Secondly, that a child of his own, male or female, be preferred before any other, because men are presumed to be more inclined by nature to advance their own children than the children of other men, and of their own rather a male than a female, because men are naturally fitter than women for actions of labour and danger. Thirdly, where his own issue faileth, rather a brother than a stranger, and so still the nearer in blood, rather than the more remote, because it is always presumed that the nearer of kin is the nearer in affection. And 'tis evident that a man receives always by reflection the most honour from the greatness of his nearest kindred. But if it be lawful for a monarch to dispose of the succession by words of contract or testament, men may perhaps object to great inconvenience, for he may sell or give his right of governing to a stranger, which, because strangers, that is, men not used to live under the same government, not speaking the same language, do commonly undervalue one another, may turn to the oppression of his subjects, which is indeed a great inconvenience. But it proceedeth not necessarily from the subjection to a stranger's government, but from the unskilfulness of the governors ignorant of the true rules of politics. And therefore the Romans, when they had subdued many nations, to make their government digestible, were wont to take away that grievance as much as they thought necessary, by giving sometimes to whole nations and sometimes to principal men of every nation they conquered, not only the privileges but also the name of Romans, and took many of them into the Senate, and offices of charge, even in the Roman city. And this was it our most wise king, King James, aimed at in endeavouring the union of his two realms of England and Scotland, which, if he could have obtained, had in all likelihood prevented the civil wars, which make both those kingdoms at this present miserable. It is not therefore any injury to the people for a monarch to dispose of the succession by will, though by the fault of many princes it hath been sometimes found inconvenient. Of the lawfulness of it, this also is an argument that whatsoever inconvenience can arrive by giving a kingdom to a stranger may arrive also by so marrying with strangers, as the right of succession may descend upon them, yet this by all men is accounted lawful. Chapter 20. Of Dominion Paternal and Despotical. A commonwealth by acquisition is that where the sovereign power is acquired by force, and it is acquired by force when men singly or many together by plurality of voices for fear of death or bonds do authorize all the actions of that man or assembly that hath their lives and liberty in his power. And this kind of dominion or sovereignty differeth from sovereignty by institution only in this, that men who choose their sovereign do it for fear of one another, and not of him whom they institute. But in this case they subject themselves to him they are afraid of. In both cases they do it for fear, which is to be noted by them that hold all such covenants, as proceed from fear of death or violence, void. Which if it were true, no man in any kind of commonwealth could be obliged to obedience. It is true that in a commonwealth once instituted or acquired, promises proceeding from fear or death or violence are no covenants, nor obliging when the thing promised is contrary to the laws. But the reason is not because it was made upon fear, but because he that promiseth it hath no right in the thing promised. Also, when he may lawfully perform and doth not, it is not the invalidity of the covenant that absolveth him, but the sentence of the sovereign. Otherwise, whensoever a man lawfully promiseth, he unlawfully breaketh. But when the sovereign, who is the actor, acquitteth him, then he is acquitted by him that exhorted the promise, as by the author of such absolution. But the rights and consequences of sovereignty are the same in both. His power cannot, without his consent, be transferred to another. He cannot forfeit it. He cannot be accused by any of his subjects of injury. He cannot be punished by them. He is judge of what is necessary for peace and judge of doctrines. He is sole legislator and supreme judge of controversies, and of the times and occasions of war and peace. To him it belongeth to choose magistrates, counsellors, commanders, and all other officers and ministers, and to determine of rewards and punishments, honour and order. The reasons whereof are the same which are alleged in the precedent chapter, for the same rights and consequences of sovereignty by institution. Dominion is acquired two ways, by generation and by conquest. The right of dominion by generation is that which the parent hath over his children, and is called paternal, and is not so derived from the generation as if therefore the parent had dominion over his child because he begat him, but from the child's consent, either express or by other sufficient arguments declared. For as to the generation, God hath ordained to man a helper, and there be always two that are equally parents. The dominion therefore over the child should belong equally to both, and he be equally subject to both, which is impossible, for no man can obey two masters. And whereas some have attributed the dominion to man only, as being the more excellent sex, they misreckon in it. For there is not always that difference of strength or prudence between the man and the woman, as that the right can be determined without war. In commonwealths this controversy is decided by the civil law, and for the most part, but not always, the sentence is in favour of the father, because for the most part commonwealths have been erected by the fathers, not by the mothers of the families. But the question lieth now in the state of mere nature, where there are supposed no laws of matrimony, no laws for the education of children. But the law of nature, and the natural inclination of the sexes one to another, and to their children, in this condition of mere nature, either the parents between themselves dispose of the dominion over the child by contract, or do not dispose thereof at all. If they dispose thereof, the right passeth according to the contract. We find in history that the Amazons contracted with the men of the neighbouring countries to whom they had recourse for issue, that the issue male should be sent back, but the female remain with themselves, so that the dominion of the females was in the mother. If there be no contract, the dominion is in the mother, for in the condition of mere nature, where there are no matrimonial laws, it cannot be known who is the father unless it be declared by the mother, and therefore the right of dominion over the child dependeth on her will and is consequently hers. Again, seeing the infant is first in the power of the mother, so that she may either nourish or expose it. If she nourish it, it oweth its life to the mother. and is therefore obliged to obey her, rather than any other, and by consequence the dominion over it is hers. But if she expose it, and another find and nourish it, the dominion is in him that nourisheth it. For it ought to obey him by whom it is preserved, because preservation of life being the end for which one man becomes subject to another, every man is supposed to promise obedience to him in whose power it is to save or destroy him. If the mother be the father's subject, the child is in the father's power. And if the father be the mother's subject, as when a sovereign queen marrieth one of her subjects, the child is subject to the mother, because the father also is her subject. If a man and a woman, monarchs of two several kingdoms, have a child, and contract concerning who shall have the dominion of him, the right of the dominion passeth by the contract. If they contract not, the dominion followeth the dominion of the place of his residence. For the sovereign of each country hath dominion over all that reside therein. He that hath the dominion over the child hath dominion also over their children's children. For he that hath dominion over the person of man hath dominion over all that is his, without which dominion were but a title without the effect. The right of succession to paternal dominion proceedeth in the same manner, as doth the right of succession to monarchy, of which I have already sufficiently spoken in the precedent chapter. Dominion acquired by conquest or victory in war is that which some writers call despotical, from despotes, which signifieth a lord or master, and is the dominion of the master over his servant. And this dominion is then acquired to the victor, when the vanquished, to avoid the present stroke of death, covenanteth either in express words or by other sufficient signs of the will, that so long as his life and the liberty of his body is allowed him, the victor shall have the use thereof at his pleasure. And after such covenant made, the vanquished is a servant, and not before. For the word servant, whether it be derived from servere, to serve, or from servare, to save, which I leave to the grammarians to dispute, is not meant a captive, which is kept in prison or bonds till the owner of him that took him or bought him of one that did shall consider what to do with him. For such men, commonly called slaves, have no obligation at all, but may break their bonds or the prison or kill or carry away captive their master justly. But one that being taken hath corporal liberty allowed him, and upon promise not to run away, nor to do violence to his master, is trusted by him. It is not therefore the victory that giveth the right of dominion over the vanquished, but his own covenant. Nor is he obliged because he is conquered, that is to say beaten and taken, or put to flight, but because he cometh in, and submitteth to the victor. Nor is the victor obliged by an enemy's rendering himself, without promise of life, to spare him from this his yielding to discretion, which obliges not the victor longer than in his own discretion he shall think fit. And that men do, when they demand, as it is now called, quarter, which the Greeks called zogria, taking alive, is to evade the present fury of the victor by submission and to compound for their life, with ransom or service. And therefore, he that hath quarter hath not his life given, but deferred till farther deliberation. For it is not in yielding on condition of life, but to discretion, and then only in his life in security, and his service due, when the victor hath trusted him with his corporal liberty. For slaves that work in prisons or fetters do it not of duty, but to avoid the cruelty of their taskmasters. The master of the servant is master also of all he hath, and may exact the use thereof, that is to say, of his goods, of his labour, of his servants, and of his children, as often as he shall think fit. For he holdeth his life of his master by the covenant of obedience, that is, of owning and authorizing whatsoever the master shall do. And in case the master, if he refuse, kill him or cast him into bonds, or otherwise punish him for his disobedience, he is himself the author of the same, and cannot accuse him of injury. In sum, the rights and consequences of both paternal and despotical dominion are the very same with those of the sovereign by institution, and for the same reasons, which reasons are set down in the precedent chapter, so that for a man that is monarch of diverse nations, whereof he hath in one the sovereignty by institution of the people assembled, and in another by conquest, that is by the submission of each particular to avoid death or bonds, to demand of one nation more than of the other, from the title of conquest as being a conquered nation, is an act of ignorance of the rights of sovereignty. For the sovereign is absolute over both alike, or else there is no sovereignty at all. And so every man may lawfully protect himself if he can with his own sword, which is the condition of war. By this it appears that a great family, if it be not part of some commonwealth, is of itself, as to the rights of sovereignty, a little monarchy. whether that family consist of a man and his children, or of a man and his servants, or of a man and his children and servants together, wherein the father of master is the sovereign. But yet a family is not properly a commonwealth, unless it be of that power by its own number, or by other opportunities, as not to be subdued without the hazard of war. For where a number of men are manifestly too weak to defend themselves united, every one may use his own reason in time of danger to save his own life, either by flight, or by submission to the enemy, as he shall think best. In the same manner as a very small company of soldiers, surprised by an army, may cast down their armies and demand quarter or run away, rather than be put to the sword, and thus much shall suffice, concerning what I find by speculation and deduction of sovereign rights, from the nature, need, and designs of men in erecting of commonwealths, and putting themselves under monarchs or assemblies entrusted with power enough for their protection. Let us now consider what the Scripture teacheth in the same point. To Moses the children of Israel say thus, Exodus 20:19, Speak thou to us, and we will hear thee, but let not God speak to us, lest we die. This is absolute obedience to Moses. Concerning the right of kings, God himself by the mouth of Samuel saith, 1 Samuel 8:11, 12, etc., This shall be the right of the king you will have to reign over you. He shall take your sons, and set them to drive his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots, and gather in his harvest, and to make his engines of war and instruments of his chariots, and shall take your daughters to make perfumes, to be his cooks and bakers. He shall take your fields, your vineyards, and your olive yards, and give them to his servants. He shall take the tithe of your corn and wine, and give it to the men of his chamber, and to his other servants. He shall take your manservants and your maidservants, and the choice of your youth, and employ them in his business. He shall take the tithe of your flocks, and you shall be his servants. This is absolute power, and summed up in the last words, You shall be his servants. Again, when the people heard what power their king was to have, yet they consented thereto, and say thus, verse 19, etc., We will be as all other nations, and our king shall judge our causes, and go before us to conduct our wars. Here is confirmed the right that sovereigns have, both to the militia and to all judicature, in which is contented as absolute power, as one man can possibly transfer to another. Again, the prayer of King Solomon to God was this, 1 Kings 3:9, Give to thy servant understanding to judge thy people, and to discern between good and evil. It belongeth therefore to the sovereign to be judge and to prescribe the rules of discerning good and evil, which rules are laws, and therefore in him is the legislative power. Saul sought the life of David, yet when it was in his power to slay Saul, and his servants would have done it, David forbade them, saying, 1 Samuel 24:9, God forbid I should do such an act against my Lord, the anointed of God. For obedience of servants, St. Paul saith, Colossians 3:20, Servants, obey your masters in all things. And verse 22, Children, obey your parents in all things. There is simple obedience in those that are subject to paternal or despotical dominion. Again, Matthew 23:2, 3. The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' chair, and therefore all that they shall bid you observe, that observe and do. There again is simple obedience, and St. Paul, Titus 3:2, warn them that they subject themselves to princes and to those that are in authority, and obey them. This obedience is also simple. Lastly, our Saviour himself acknowledges that men ought to pay such taxes as are by kings imposed, where he says, Give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and paid such taxes himself, and that the king's word is sufficient to take anything from any subject when there is need, and that the king is judge of that need, for he himself, as king of the Jews, commanded his disciples to take the ass, and ass's colt to carry him into Jerusalem, saying, Matthew 21:2, 3, Go into the village over against you, and you shall find a she-ass tied and her colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. And if any man ask you what you mean by it, say, The Lord hath need of them, and they will let them go. They will not ask whether his necessity be a sufficient title, nor whether he be judge of that necessity, but acquiesce in the will of the Lord. To these places may be added also that of Genesis 3:5, You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And verse 11, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee thou shouldest not eat? For the cognizance of judicature of good and evil being forbidden by the name of the fruit of the tree of knowledge as a trial of Adam's obedience, The devil, to inflame the ambition of the woman, to whom that fruit already seemed beautiful, told her that by tasting it they should be as gods, knowing good and evil. Whereupon, having both eaten, they did indeed take upon them God's office, which is judicature of good and evil, but acquired no new ability to distinguish between them aright. And whereas it is said that having eaten they saw that they were naked, no man hath so interpreted that place as if they were formerly blind, as saw not their own skins. The meaning is plain, that it was then they first judged their nakedness, wherein it was God's will to create them, to be uncomely, and by being ashamed did tacitly censure God himself. And thereupon God saith, Hast thou eaten, etc., as if he should say, Dost thou that owest me obedience take upon thee to judge of my commandments? Whereby it is clearly, though allegorically, signified that the commands of them that have the right to command are not by their subjects to be censured nor disputed. So it appeareth plainly to my understanding, both from reason and scripture, that the sovereign power, whether placed in one man, as in monarchy, or in one assembly of men, as in popular and aristocratical commonwealths, is as great as possibly men can be imagined to make it. And though of so unlimited a power men may fancy many evil consequences, yet the consequences of the want of it, which is perpetual war of every man against his neighbour, are much worse. The condition of man in this life shall never be without inconveniences, but there happeneth in no commonwealth any great inconvenience, but what proceeds from the subject's disobedience, and breach of those covenants, from which the commonwealth had its being. And whosoever thinking sovereign power too great, will seek to make it less, must subject himself to the power that can limit it, that is to say, to a greater. The greatest objection is that of the practice when men ask where and when such power has by subjects been acknowledged. But one may ask them again, when or where has there been a kingdom long free from sedition and civil war? In those nations whose commonwealths have been long lived, and not been destroyed but by foreign war, the subjects never did dispute of the sovereign power. But howsoever an argument for the practice of men that have not sifted to the bottom, and with exact reason weighed the causes and nature of commonwealths, and suffer daily those miseries that proceed from the ignorance thereof, is invalid. For though in all places of the world men should lay the foundation of their houses on the sand, it could not thence be inferred that so it ought to be. The skill of making and maintaining commonwealths consisteth in certain rules, as doth arithmetic and geometry, not as tennis play on practice only, which rules neither poor men have the leisure, nor men that have had the leisure have hitherto had the curiosity or the method to find out.